Master Sergeant Jake Carter had faced death before. He had crawled through enemy-infested jungles, survived ambushes, and walked away from situations that should have killed him. But nothing had prepared him for this. The last thing he remembered was the jungle of Colombia, a covert mission gone sideways. His unit had been tracking a cartel with rumored ties to something bigger, something beyond Earth's understanding. Then came the blinding light, the gut-wrenching pull, and darkness. Now, he was somewhere else. His eyes snapped open, muscles coiled with instinctive readiness. The sky above was a bruised purple, twin moons casting an eerie glow over a dense alien landscape. The air smelled different, metallic, humid, thick with an unfamiliar energy. His pulse remained steady, but his mind raced. He sat up slowly, assessing. His weapons were gone, stripped from him with precision. His fatigues remained, though torn and stained. A faint shimmer flickered in the air around him, some kind of containment field. He was in a cage, its walls humming softly. Beyond it, others lay in similar confinement, some stirring, others motionless. Then came the voices. Not human. A guttural, clicking language like bones grinding together. Shadows shifted beyond the glow of the field, tall figures with armor that looked like it had been carved from obsidian and reinforced with technology far beyond anything Earth possessed. Their eyes gleamed with predatory amusement. He forced himself to remain still, breathing controlled. Panic was the enemy. He had been in impossible situations before, but this was something else. These creatures weren't just captors. They were hunters, and he had been brought here for sport. A sharp hiss filled the air as the containment field deactivated. Jake tensed, muscles tight. The largest of the creatures stepped forward, a massive figure standing nearly 8 feet tall. Its armor pulsed with an organic glow, its elongated skull marked with deep scars that spoke of past battles. This was no mere foot soldier. This was a leader. The alien tilted its head, observing him as if inspecting a prize. When it finally spoke, its voice was guttural, yet disturbingly clear. Human. You fight. You run. You die. Jake didn't move. He let silence stretch between them, measuring the creature's intent. Fear would get him nothing. These things wanted a reaction, wanted to see their prey squirm. He refused to give them that satisfaction. Another cage opened. A man staggered out, young, barely in his 20s. Not military. He was panting, eyes wild. Before Jake could warn him, the young man bolted. A blur of movement. One of the aliens raised an arm, a sleek, barbed projectile launching from its wrist. It struck the runner in the back. He collapsed mid-stride, his scream cut short. The creatures chittered in amusement. The body was dragged away. Jake clenched his jaw, suppressing the rage boiling inside him. This was a game to them, a demonstration. Show the weak what happens when they run. His cage hummed again, the invisible walls gone. The leader gestured toward the dense jungle beyond. The hunt begins. Jake didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, not in fear, but strategy. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. He darted into the foliage, using the terrain to his advantage. This wasn't a panicked escape. This was reconnaissance. The jungle was alive with unfamiliar sounds, creatures slithering, chirping, the distant rumble of something massive. He moved quickly but deliberately, cataloging everything. Elevation changes, potential cover, hazards. His years of survival training kicked in, overriding any instinct to simply flee. Then came the first sign of pursuit. A faint shimmer, barely perceptible, shifting through the trees. They had cloaking technology, but invisibility wasn't invulnerability. Jake slowed his breathing, attuning himself to the environment. He listened, waited, felt the shift in air pressure. A branch snapped, no natural cause. They were close. Too close. He needed to level the playing field. His fingers found a jagged rock. It wasn't much, but it was something. He crouched low, pressing himself against the trunk of a massive tree, waiting. A flicker. Movement. The shimmer passed mere feet away. He struck, aiming for the soft tissue where the neck met the skull. A guttural hiss of pain. The alien staggered, its cloaking flickering. Jake didn't waste a second. He grabbed its weapon, a sleek, wrist-mounted blade, twisting it free and driving it deep into the creature's throat. It collapsed, gurgling. He pulled the blade free, studying it. Lightweight, wickedly sharp, and, most importantly, effective. One down. He stripped the alien of anything useful, a small device strapped to its arm, some kind of energy cell. No firearms. They wanted this to be personal. Archaic. A test of skill. Fools. He melted into the shadows, mind already working 3 steps ahead. The hunters believed themselves superior, but superiority bred arrogance. And arrogance was a weakness. More movement. They had found the body. Their chittering grew agitated. Good. Let them feel fear. He wasn't their prey. They were his. The jungle was their domain. That was their first mistake. Jake Carter had spent his life mastering environments just like this. He knew how to move unseen, how to read the land, how to listen to the world and let it tell him where his enemies were. The Xal'Zir thought they were the apex predators, that their technology and experience made them invincible. He would teach them otherwise. He crouched low, pressing his back against the thick, twisted trunk of an alien tree. The air was damp, thick with the scent of something like iron and rotting citrus. Strange vines pulsed with bioluminescence, casting shifting shadows against the underbrush. It was a world designed to swallow prey whole, but he had survived worse. Somewhere to his left, movement. Subtle. Controlled. They weren't stomping through the jungle like arrogant victors anymore. They had found their fallen brother, and now they were hunting him in earnest. Good. Let them try. He reached for the blade he had taken, its edge honed from something like obsidian, but stronger. The Xal'Zir didn't use firearms in their hunts. Not because they couldn't, but because they preferred the thrill of the kill. They were warriors who took pride in their skill, who believed in proving their dominance through personal combat. It would be their undoing. A shimmer in the foliage ahead. Nearly imperceptible, but he caught the distortion as it shifted against the backdrop of the jungle. Cloaking tech was good, but it wasn't perfect. Not against a man who had spent his life spotting things that weren't meant to be seen. Jake moved low and fast, silent as a shadow. He picked up a smooth, fist-sized stone and hurled it into the brush to his right. The impact was just enough to break the jungle's rhythm, to create a sound that didn't belong. The shimmer turned, reacting. That was all the opportunity he needed. He launched himself forward, the stolen blade flashing in his grip. His target barely had time to turn before Jake drove the weapon up beneath its chin, through the thin, unarmored flesh of its throat. A gurgling hiss escaped as the Xal'Zir staggered, its cloaking failing in a cascade of blue flickers. He rode the body to the ground, twisting the blade for good measure before pulling it free. Another one down, but the jungle was already reacting. The creatures had a system, a way of communicating across distances. No sooner had the body hit the ground than an unnatural shriek cut through the air, echoing across the canopy. A signal, a warning. Jake's heartbeat remained steady. Let them come. He melted back into the underbrush, moving before they could triangulate his position. He needed more than just hit-and-run tactics. He needed to shift the balance. As long as they dictated the hunt, he was at a disadvantage. But if he could make them doubt, if he could disrupt their confidence, he could turn them against each other. He reached for the small device he had taken from the first body, studying its smooth surface. It was no weapon, but it had purpose. A control mechanism. Maybe a tracker? Then he felt the vibration. Faint, pulsing rhythmic. A beacon. They weren't just tracking him. They were tracking their own. Jake's lips curled into a grim smile. He pressed the device against the dead Xal'Zir's armor and activated it. The pulse changed, shifting frequency, sending a new signal into the air. If it worked like he hoped, the hunters would come to investigate. And when they did, they wouldn't find a helpless human. They'd find a scene of their own warrior, slain and exposed. He moved again, quick and deliberate. The jungle wasn't just an obstacle. It was a tool. The terrain was uneven, the plant life strange but adaptable. He found a thick vine with a fibrous interior, strong enough to weave into cordage. A fallen branch, dense and sharp, could serve as a spear. The jungle provided, as long as you knew how to ask. He didn't have to wait long. The first Xal'Zir arrived cautiously, its movements slower than before. It didn't storm in with the arrogance of an unchallenged hunter. It approached like prey that had realized it was being watched. Jake remained still, hidden beneath the roots of a massive tree, waiting. The creature examined its fallen kin, clicking softly, its posture tense. Then the others arrived. 3 more, forming a loose perimeter. Their body language betrayed them. Uncertainty, frustration, a creeping sense of unease. This wasn't how the hunt was supposed to go. They had expected terror, panic. Instead, they were the ones finding bodies. Jake adjusted his grip on the makeshift spear, measuring his next move. He could take another one here, but the real goal wasn't just to kill. It was to control the battlefield. A growl from one of the hunters. Aggressive, directed at its own kind. A dispute. Maybe over tactics, maybe over honor. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had planted the first seeds of doubt. He exhaled slowly. 1 strike. Quick. Precise. He shifted his weight, muscles coiling like a spring. Then he moved. The spear flew, striking true, piercing the soft joint where armor met torso. The Xal'Zir staggered, hissing in pain. The others reacted instantly, weapons drawn, turning in different directions, searching for the attacker. But Jake was already gone. He didn't stick around to see how they reacted. He moved, fast and silent, weaving through the foliage like a ghost. He didn't need to witness their anger firsthand. He could hear it in the way their voices rose, in the way their movements became erratic. They weren't just hunting him anymore. They were afraid of him. And fear was a weapon sharper than any blade. The night on this alien world was darker than any Jake had ever known. The twin moons offered little light, their glow swallowed by the thick canopy. Even with his honed instincts, he had to rely on sound more than sight. The jungle breathed around him, alive with the distant chitter of unseen predators and the slow, rhythmic hum of something vast moving beyond the trees. But he wasn't the one being stalked anymore. He was the shadow, the specter haunting the Xal'Zir. They had always been the hunters, always chosen their prey, always dictated the rules of the game. But Jake had flipped the board, and now they were scrambling to put the pieces back together. They traveled in tighter formations now, moving with caution instead of confidence. Their voices carried frustration and uncertainty, their posture rigid with tension. He had shattered their illusion of invincibility, and he wasn't done yet. His stolen blade rested in his grip, slick with alien blood. He crouched low against the twisted roots of an enormous tree, watching as 3 Xal'Zir moved through the underbrush below. They spoke in guttural clicks, their weapons drawn, their heads snapping in every direction. One of them carried a scanner, a small device pulsing with energy as it swept the area. They were trying to pin him down. Jake let his breathing slow, controlled his pulse, melted into the silence. The jungle was full of noises, but silence. That was unnatural. That was where death hid. And that was why, when he moved, it wasn't without sound. He picked up a fist-sized rock and tossed it deep into the brush to his right. The impact was subtle, but to ears as sharp as theirs, it was a crack of thunder. The Xal'Zir spun, weapons raised, and that was all the opening he needed. He lunged, striking low and fast, the blade driving upward into the nearest hunter's abdomen. The alien made a wet, choking sound as Jake twisted the weapon free. Its body hit the ground, convulsing, even as the others turned back toward him. A bolt of energy streaked past his head, searing the bark behind him. So they had finally abandoned tradition. They were done playing by the old rules. Now they wanted him dead, honor be damned. That suited him just fine. He dove into the undergrowth as another shot cracked through the air. The blast tore through the foliage, igniting the strange, fibrous plants with an eerie blue fire. He hit the ground hard, rolling beneath a tangle of thick roots, and came up already moving. The Xal'Zir weren't used to prey that fought back. They weren't used to battle being anything other than ritual. But Jake had spent his life in war. A guttural shout came from behind him. He didn't look back. He sprinted through the trees, using the terrain to break line of sight. He was bleeding, nothing serious, but enough to leave a trail. He had to disappear fast. Then, ahead, salvation. A ship. It wasn't large, maybe a scouting vessel, sleek and insect-like, resting in a clearing beyond the tree line. It was guarded, of course. 2 Xal'Zir warriors standing rigid at the base of the ramp. But Jake had fought his way through worse odds before breakfast. He kept low, circling the perimeter. His first instinct was to rush them, take them out quickly, but he stopped himself. He wasn't fighting humans. These creatures had reflexes he hadn't fully tested, senses he didn't yet understand. Rushing him blind was suicide. Instead, he reached for the stolen tracker on his belt. It had worked once before. Maybe it would work again. He activated the beacon and tossed it into the jungle behind him. The pulse flared to life, an urgent, frantic signal. If the Xal'Zir were anything like the soldiers he'd fought before, they'd react. And they did. The guards stiffened, their mandibles clicking in rapid succession. One of them barked something into a wrist-mounted communicator, and within seconds, the jungle to his left came alive with movement. The hunters were coming, but Jake wasn't where they expected him to be. The moment the guards turned, he was moving. A dead sprint, silent as possible, blade in one hand. The first guard barely had time to register the attack before Jake was on him, driving the blade up between the armored plates of its lower back. The second turned, weapon rising, too slow. Jake grabbed the dying alien's own rifle from its hands and fired point blank. The blast took the second guard in the chest, sending it sprawling backward. He didn't stop to check if they were dead. He was already sprinting up the ramp. The interior of the ship was dark, sleek, designed for efficiency over comfort. Controls pulsed with unreadable symbols, displays shifting as the vessel registered an unrecognized presence. Jake didn't need to understand the language to recognize the basics. Engines, navigation, weapons. He found a control panel that looked most like a flight interface and pressed his stolen device against it. For a second, nothing. Then the ship roared to life. Outside, shouts of alarm. The hunters had realized what was happening. Jake didn't wait for them to react. He slammed a hand down on the closest lever, and the vessel lurched beneath him, engines igniting in a violent burst. The ramp was still open, the wind screaming through the cabin, but he had no time to fix that. Blaster fire streaked past the cockpit, grazing the hull. The Xal'Zir weren't letting him go without a fight. Jake gritted his teeth and yanked the controls. The ship veered sharply, the stabilizers fighting against the sudden movement. The ground dropped away beneath him. Jungle became a blur, then a distant smear. A bolt of plasma clipped the wing, sending a tremor through the vessel, but he held steady. Altitude. That was the priority. Get high, get clear, and then a warning klaxon blared. Red symbols flashed across the screen. Something big was locking onto him. Jake's stomach tightened as he turned his gaze upward. Above, breaking through the cloud cover, was the Xal'Zir mothership. It was massive, a fortress suspended in the void, its hull bristling with weaponry. And one of those weapons had just targeted him. He was out of time. His hands moved instinctively over the controls, fingers flying across unfamiliar symbols. He had one chance. The ship's systems were still responding to the stolen tracker. If he could override just one command, trigger a signal back to the mothership. A sound like the universe tearing open filled his ears. The ship shuddered violently, alarms screaming. The mothership had fired. Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed both hands onto the console and triggered the only command he understood. Emergency jump. The world fractured around him. Light twisted, space folded, and then silence. He was gone. The void swallowed him whole. For a fraction of a second, Jake existed in nothingness. A space without up or down, without breath or thought. Then reality snapped back like a rubber band, and he was thrown forward, his stomach lurching as the ship tore from hyperspace and re-entered normal space with a violent shudder. Warning lights blazed across the console, symbols flashing in angry red streaks. The stolen vessel was in bad shape. He sucked in a breath, forcing himself to focus. The last thing he remembered was the Xal'Zir mothership locking onto him, firing. He had hit emergency jump, hoping for anything other than immediate annihilation. But where had it thrown him? Outside the cockpit, space stretched vast and infinite. No visible planets. No immediate signs of pursuit. But the ship was drifting, its stabilizers failing. A low, rhythmic beeping echoed through the cabin, a countdown. Something critical was on the verge of collapse. Jake gritted his teeth, scanning the console. He was no pilot, but survival wasn't about expertise. It was about adaptation. A crude star map flickered before him. Incomplete, but readable. A planetary body nearby, close enough for an emergency landing. His fingers moved quickly, rerouting power to thrusters. The ship groaned in protest, but responded. He angled the nose downward, pushing the failing engines to their limit. The planet swelled in the viewport, a barren, rocky world covered in swirling sandstorms. Not ideal, but better than the alternative. The moment the ship hit atmosphere, everything went to hell. Fire licked at the hull, metal screaming as gravity took hold. The vessel spun, turbulence slamming Jake into his restraints. He fought the controls, struggling to level out, to find any sort of stable descent. The ground rushed toward him, jagged cliffs and dunes stretching endlessly. Then, impact. The world shattered into chaos. The ship skidded across the terrain, tearing up rock and sand, metal shearing away in violent bursts. Jake's body strained against the harness, the force threatening to tear him apart. Then, finally, the ship came to a halt, half buried in the dunes. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling of damaged electronics and the slow hiss of escaping pressure. Jake forced his fingers to unclench from the controls. His body ached, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. He unbuckled and staggered to his feet. Smoke curled from the ruined systems, the air inside growing hot. He had to move. Grabbing a salvaged weapon, one of the Xal'Zir rifles, he forced open the emergency hatch and climbed out. The planet stretched endless and desolate before him. The air was breathable but thin, the sky a pale yellow, choked with distant storms. It was the kind of place people didn't visit unless they had no other choice. Behind him, the wrecked ship smoldered. He wouldn't be leaving in that. Then, movement. Jake froze, muscles tensing. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the dunes. Humanoid, armed, watching. Not Xal'Zir. He tightened his grip on the rifle, but didn't raise it. These weren't hunters, at least not the same kind. Their armor was mismatched, scavenged. Survivors. Maybe mercenaries. Maybe worse. One of them, a woman with a scar cutting across her cheek, stepped forward. She studied him, eyes sharp, calculating. Then she spoke. "You're either the dumbest bastard in the galaxy or the luckiest." Jake exhaled, steadying himself. "Guess we're about to find out." The others closed in, weapons still lowered but ready. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet.